All right. Halito, welcome everyone. Welcome back to the Choctaw virtual speaker series. Sahochafua Megan Baker, and I'm your host for today's Choctaw. Today, our interpreter of Choctaw knowledge is Dr. Donna Akers, a Choctaw citizen, an associate professor of women and gender studies at the University of Texas at Arlington. When I first started organizing this series in May, Dr. Akers was one of the first scholars that I was really excited to reach out to. So I'm so happy that she could join us today. When I first read Dr. Akers' book, Living in the Land of Death, it was unlike any other history I'd ever read about Oklahoma Choctaws, because I was reading for once a history from a Choctaw perspective, and that's so kind of rare. It was a breath of fresh air for me because I was used to reading books by historians who didn't take our histories, our philosophies of life, and our language seriously, and they didn't think that they were critical sources for understanding the past or writing history. So her book shows the importance of paying attention to these sources that we cite as our basis for understanding the past. And she shows us how everything has biases, and we kind of have to pay attention to that. We'll go a little bit more into this more in depth during the questions portion of our talk, but I just wanted to point that out because it's kind of really so important, because non-Indigenous people have spoken over Indigenous care to the role of women in Choctaw society and how shifts in their roles due to colonialism have impacted the way that we understand the present. This work is super important, and when people ask me what they should read of understanding our Choctaw past, I always give them that book. So now I'll kind of turn it over to Dr. Akers to talk a little bit about her book, give us kind of a brief synopsis, and then we'll have a kind of question and answer where I prepared some questions for her. And if you have any questions as you're watching and listening, there's a chat function in WebEx where you can kind of type in your questions, and we'll go over those towards the end. So now to Dr. Akers.
Halito, everyone. It's very nice to be here, and I hope that everyone that is listening is curious and interested in hearing one story about the Choctaw people. I don't claim to be the authority on Choctaw history. I'm sure that there are many people listening that may be at least as knowledgeable and perhaps much more so. So I welcome your input as well. Megan asked me to talk a little bit about my book and what is sort of an overview of the book itself. So I thought I would give you sort of a brief summary of the various parts of the book and what I was trying to do with it before we get to more specific questions and answers. So when I started writing this book, I wanted to represent a Choctaw voice, not the voice. And that's really important to remember because there are many thousands of Choctaw perspectives and voices. Mine is just one. When I was growing up, I used to hear the oral traditions. I heard the language. I heard the belief systems as passed down by my extended family in the Choctaw Nation. And so I wanted to talk in my book, I wanted to present some of those stories and some of those traditions and to write history from a perspective that was a little different from what we get from mainstream scholars at the time. I wrote this book in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, and it was published in 2004. At that time, there were a number of concerns that I and other Indigenous scholars in the Academy had. The main one was that we were the second wave, really, of Indigenous scholars. Vine Deloria and many other of his cohort were the pathbreakers. They were the ones who began to open the academy to Indigenous scholars. Myself and several other scholars that were writing in the 90s and early 2000s were really the next wave, I think. And we were very concerned about what we call decolonization of the historical record. We were very concerned that Choctaw history, but also the history of other Indigenous groups, nations, and areas, regional areas, were written from a Eurocentric perspective at the worst, but also from actually a pretense of knowledge, intimate knowledge about Indigenous people by outsiders and people who did not grow up in our cultures. They oftentimes had absolutely no knowledge or respect for oral traditions, for non-written textual sources, or for sources that were written in Indigenous languages. So when I started looking at the historiography of how Native history, or as it was called in the early 1900s, Native history was actually referred to as Indian history. And Indian history, as written by Grant Foreman and Angie DeBow, who were two non-Native people, historians who wrote from a very sympathetic perspective, but one that was not Indigenous, about Indian people. And they became extremely well-known. Their books were treasured by many people, certainly scholars in the mid to late 1900s, and were still used when I was in graduate school and the first years of my writing experience. So these people were writing very sympathetic histories, but a lot of it was written as though Indigenous people, Choctaws in particular, were victims of the invading, white people. They were apologists in some respects for the colonizers, but they also were very sympathetic to the experiences of Indigenous people. After that, we began to see some big changes, but the group of people that were in the academy early on when I began my career were really interested in questions of how do we change the writing of history to include perspectives from the Indigenous peoples themselves, not from outsiders who were trying to interpret Native history. And so we began looking at decolonization literature and writing some of it ourselves, and trying to ask the questions that would interrogate the way history was written. And I won't belabor this any further, but that was a really important change in the late 90s, early 2000s, to moving to a different methodology. I think culminating with Linda Twice Smith's decolonization methodologies, or decolonizing methodologies, which is really the Bible for most Indigenous scholars and is even treasured today. So she expressed and articulated many of the current concerns that many of us have had. And jumping right into the meat of what I was talking about in my book, I thought it was extremely important to look at culture and to give voice to spiritual, cultural, and traditional beliefs of the Choctaw people. And the way I did this was by including a number of sources that other historians that were, especially the outsiders that were not writing from a Native perspective, left out. And I found many sources for that material, not only traditional oral history, but also through interviewing and listening to elders, looking at written documents in Choctaw in the archives, which surprisingly enough, there are hundreds and hundreds of documents in just two repositories that I was familiar with in the Choctaw language. Those, of course, are almost entirely omitted from any other historical effort that I have seen written about the Choctaw people, and it's a real travesty. So I started with taking a look at our origin stories, and those have been passed down through history, through our families primarily. There's a number of them actually, but the one that I thought was most commonly subscribed to was that we originated in the far west, and that two brothers or a prophet, depending on which version you're looking at, moved the people east in an easterly direction, actually southeasterly, and eventually we ended up in what is now the state of Mississippi. The Chickasaws and Choctaws and Cherokees, Seminoles, and Muskogee people were very closely related. In many of those tribes, of course, speak Muskogee, which is the same language, although different dialects, and then the Cherokees speak a different language. But the traditions and values and belief systems overlapped pretty much, very significantly. So sometimes when you look at histories that were written by ethnologists, as they called themselves, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, you find a lot of valuable information, even though you have to sift through it because it's from a Eurocentric perspective, but a lot of anthropological type of information that is useful, in your research. After that, our origin stories, I also wanted to talk about a variety of beliefs that were essentially coming from and embodied in the Choctaw language. And this is very essential to writing Native history of any kind, or more broadly, Native studies. If you don't know the language of the people about whom you are trying to write, then it's, to me, an absolute absurdity. Just imagine in the academy if a French historian or a French writer of French history or culture did not know the French language. I mean, we can see that very clearly with European PhD programs, for example. But if you all are graduate students, I'm sure you've had the experience that I had, which is that for Choctaw history, the PhD programs recommended you study French. It's just absurdities. So why not study Choctaw? Why not, if you're doing the history of the Osage people, why aren't you studying their language? There's so many of our nations that, of course, have distinct languages that express their cultural worldview. So it's very important to understand and to know the language as much as possible. And there are many schools now and other institutions that would allow students to learn their indigenous languages, even if they were not privileged to grow up in an indigenous speaking family. So I talked about a lot of the belief systems and spiritual customs and traditions. And then I talked a lot about gender throughout the book. And to me, that's a real extremely important difference between European or Western cultures and indigenous cultures. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. I saw that Megan has a question she wanted to ask about that. So I'll just briefly say that it's reiterate that it's extremely important, and we need to take that into consideration if we're writing about indigenous peoples. The other thing that I spent a lot of time on in the book were the lopsided treaties, the methods and means that the United States government used to deprive indigenous nations of their land through the so-called treaty system. at the time, I was wrestling with a framework, with terminology and so forth. So when I was looking at reviewing my book for this talk, I was thinking in terms of some of the things, the ways that the scholarship has advanced over the years in terms of looking at settler colonialism and some of the genocidal tactics that colonizing powers used to clear the lands of indigenous peoples. And of course, that's what happened to the Choctaws. We went treaty after treaty after treaty, trying to strike compromises, trying to hold on to what was ours in Mississippi in the face of overwhelming superiority in terms of military strength, aggressiveness, and just an insatiable acquisitiveness of the American invaders. We did not succeed in hanging on to our indigenous lands, our original lands in Mississippi, but a portion of our people did. And their story is a very interesting one. So today, if you go to Mississippi, there's, of course, the Choctaw Indians of Mississippi, a tribal nation that is, of course, the people who stayed behind from the main body of the Choctaw people who were forced out and forced into permanent exile in what is today the state of Oklahoma. Those treaties and the techniques that were perfected over the years by the U.S. government, at least as far as the Choctaws began, it really started about the time of the Jefferson administration, so quite early in the 19th century. And Jefferson honed his tactics of some really interesting techniques I'll just real quickly touch on. What he was doing was he encouraged the governors and Indian agents and U.S. representatives of all sorts out in the Indian country to entice the indigenous peoples, especially their leaders, into debt to the American traders. As soon as the several individuals started racking up debt, Jefferson would then tell the traders, well, make it even worse, give them alcohol, give them all kinds of arms, give them whatever they need, but get the main leaders in debt. The whole effort, of course, was then to have the U.S. government come in to the Choctaw Nation and others and say, well, gee, if you would cede, say, 400,000 or 500,000 acres, then we would write off $40,000 in debts. Now, the really interesting thing here, in part, is that under the property laws and the property regime of the capitalist nation of the United States, what they did was they were guaranteeing to U.S. citizens private property rights. So, for example, if the leader, let's say the governor of New York, got into tremendous debt with anybody, no one would expect the people of New York to pay off the debt for that governor in privately procured debt. What happened with the indigenous people, though, was the U.S. was using all kinds of tricks and fraud and lies and all kinds of very cynical moves. So what they would do is come in and say, gee, Mr. Captain, gee, Mr. Chief, what we'll do is we will pay your debt to the Panton Leslie Trading Company that you personally owe, not the tribe, you personally. And we will force the tribe to cede enormous swatches of land to pay off your debts. And that's exactly what happened, especially in the early 1800s, when session after session after session were made by the Choctaw leaders in a desperate attempt to make up to pay the personal debt of key men off, because the U.S. was saying, if you don't do this, we're going to take the land anyway. So, they struck the best bargain that they could. And I don't think in most cases our leaders were corrupted in the sense that they were forcing the nation to pay off their debts and cynically running up more debts and then forcing the nation to pay them off again. I think this was just part of the market economy system that was invading Indian territories and was being exploited by the US government in cahoots with private business to deprive indigenous peoples of their land and to essentially clear the lands of its indigenous inhabitants. So that's what happened in some cases. In other cases, there were many things like tricks and fraud and bribes and lies until in 1830, the United States government came in and tried to obtain the last of the Choctaw holdings in Mississippi and force us to go to what is now Oklahoma through the Dancing Rabbit Creek Treaty. And that treaty was a travesty. And I talk a lot in the book about the techniques that the US government was using. And essentially there, I looked at a bunch of Choctaw records in Choctaw, and I looked at what the leaders were saying, writing personal letters to each other about what was taking place. And then later after the treaty about their accounts of what happened on the treaty grounds. And it differs significantly from the narrative of that treaty and its aftermath written by non-Choctaw historians. So I think it's extremely important that we look at things like that. Just briefly, what happened was the Choctaw, the US representative in these treaty negotiations was actually the Secretary of State. If you can imagine today, the Secretary of State going to negotiate a treaty personally with indigenous people. That's what was happening. So the Secretary of State was there, and he essentially threatened the Choctaw people, the Choctaw leaders who refused to cede another step, another foot of their land to the US government, no matter what he threatened, including complete annihilation of the people. They still refused. And there were thousands of Choctaw people witnessing this on the grounds that day. And what happened was that that Eaton said, or the Secretary of State said to the Choctaw leaders, okay, if you don't agree this time, then that's it. There's not going to be any more negotiations, and we're going to bring in the US military and annihilate your people. They still said no. And they left the treaty grounds, except all people, thousands of Choctaw people left the treaty grounds along with their leaders, and they left behind one group, and they didn't even know it. And this group was led by Greenwood LaFleur, who took it upon himself to sign a fraudulent treaty called the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, without the knowledge or consent of the vast majority of Choctaw people and their leaders, their elected leaders. Instead, he usurped that power and did it himself. And of course, the Secretary of State took that so-called treaty and ran with it to Washington to present it to the Senate to get it ratified and call it a done deal. And he represented that as a legitimate treaty that was signed by the leadership of the legitimate leadership of the Choctaws, and the majority of Choctaw people assented to this treaty and these conditions. And it was a complete fraud. But this happened over and over in that period. This was the 1830s where, Jackson and his group were essentially going from tribe to tribe to tribe, doing this similar things, if not identical, to the negotiations at that treaty. So anyway, I don't want to take too much time. So once I get started, I'm pretty much gone. I could talk about the story of what happened to the Choctaws in the 19th century forever. So instead of doing that, let me just quickly recap what happened then after that. After the Choctaws were forced to Oklahoma, we were forced out in waves. It was not one removal; it was several removals. And many people stayed behind And some people went to the new Choctaw Nation, stayed there for a year or two, gave up, and went back to the old Choctaw Nation. And as I mentioned before, the Mississippi Choctaw people that were what became the Indians that have remained behind, and I believe they call themselves the Choctaw Indians of Mississippi. There were many people that came and went. So this whole idea of, everybody went in some big trail of tears is sort of inaccurate for the Choctaws. And these removals also, I might add, happened all over the United States, from people in the North, our indigenous friends in the North, and nations in the Northeast. Nations all over the country were forced to have their own so-called trail of tears and were forced into Oklahoma. So the chaos that resulted from this in terms of the Choctaw people in the 1830s was just disastrous. And I spend a long time talking about that in my book and what specifically made up this, the problems that they were having in this new land. And then I think the rest of it is really talking about the tremendous troubles that the Choctaw Nation began to incur in the late 1840s up until about 1885 or 90, when the Dawes Act was passed and things really got insane. But in the period between 1840 and 1890, there was also a little civil war, as all of you will remember. And this was another excuse for the U.S. government to punish indigenous peoples, Choctaws in particular, in Indian Territory, and to confiscate an enormous part of our land. So I wanted to see, I don't know, Megan, can we show them that one map with the 4 different maps, or do you have that? Do I need to try to do that? I can't hear you. Okay. No, that's okay. We won't do that. I just want to recommend to everybody that if you have the opportunity to do that, I hate to try this. I'm afraid it'll get me out of this and I won't be able to find it again. If you have an opportunity to go out and find the map, there's a Wikipedia entry on McGirt versus Oklahoma, which is the Supreme Court ruling that just came down a few weeks ago. And if you go out and look at the Wikipedia, I don't usually recommend Wikipedia incidentally, but if you look at that article on McGirt v. Oklahoma, you will find a map that shows 4 different time capsules or time snapshots of what was happening in Indian Territory and where we lost our land and when. So over the 19th century, after we were forced to Oklahoma, we began losing our land, partly to the Chickasaws, who were our, brother tribe. So it was a mutually agreeable thing. But then later, after the Civil War, the United States government came in there and diminished the holdings of the indigenous people so that they could force some of what remained of other indigenous groups into the western part of Oklahoma. And so they wanted our western part of our nation so that they could clear out many other areas of the United States and force Indian people into those areas. So I'm going to just stop now. And Megan, if you'd like, if I can figure out how to hear you.
Oh, I realized I hit it on mute. Okay. But thank you. Yes, I think that's an excellent kind of overview and gives people a kind of good sense of what's going on in the book. So now we have our questions that we have prepared. So I actually kind of wanted to know a little bit about your journey in becoming a professor and how did you get down this path to write this amazing book?
Oh, thanks. Well, I started out my career as a young person as a marketing professional for IBM. And so I spent about 15 years working for IBM and other major computer manufacturers as a marketing representative. And then when I was in my, I guess it was my mid 30s or so, I was visiting my grandmother in Oklahoma. I was attending, where was I? I guess I was out in California. And we had a moment, an evening where we stayed up talking. And in the early hours of the night, as we were both getting sleepy and were thinking about going to bed, she turned to me and she said, out of the blue, it seemed, "What are you doing, Donna?" And I said, "What am I doing?" Well, I'm sitting here talking to you. What do you mean? And she said, "No, I mean, what are you doing with your life?" And I said, "Well, I'm selling computers." And when she put it that way, and I had to answer her, I began, it wasn't, completely new, but I thought, oh my God, this sounds so terrible, so selfish. I'm selling computers because I make lots of money doing it. What is that? And she said, I thought from the time you were a little girl, you had a special role to play. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, as a teacher. And I said, what do you mean, like elementary school or high school or something? And she said, no, a teacher to our people. And I said, well, I'll think about that. And I came away from that kind of confused. But after the weeks passed, I finally realized that dovetailed with this feeling of almost anomia that I had, that I was just kind of drifting, that my work didn't mean anything to me or to anybody else. And so I, at that time, decided that I would attempt to do what she was talking about doing. And that in order to do that, as you can imagine, as a 30-something, who had never done anything except for, sell computers, I decided that it was time to go back and work on a graduate degree and prepare myself to invade the academy as a Choctaw woman and to present my perspective of Choctaw history and to hopefully reach young Choctaw people, but also other Indigenous students and people generally, not just, of course, Indigenous people, but also to teach white people about our history and our perspective, because I really felt very strongly that there was a story to tell that wasn't being told. So that's when I went back and I, spent years getting my PhD and then started in the academy.
Wow, that's insane.
Yes.
Well, I feel like it definitely, your grandma's words have kind of lived out. I've seen, when I talk to kind of other Choctaws who are kind of radical and care about decolonizing, it can be I remember one time I went to a tribal council meeting and this kid had a copy of your book with him. He was going to have this conversation about the water compacts in Choctaw Nation. And I was like, whoa, this is so crazy, because the book just has that kind of power in it. So.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So you kind of answered the other question, but why was it history that you kind of went to? Because some of it is stories, and maybe this is kind of how I got into anthropology, was I wanted to hear people's stories, and so that's kind of why I went down that particular path. So why was it history for you?
Well, as an anthropologist, I'm sure you're aware of the history of anthropology. It's even worse than the history of history, because the problems that I saw were that the books that I read, and I was always a big reader, so I would pick up books and read them on American history and other subjects that interested me, including Indian history. And I kept reading these things that were just awful. They were just shocking. And I'll never forget, in one of my early graduate seminars taught by an expert in early American history, he assigned a book. What in the world's the name of it? It was On the Ocean Blue or something. If I could remember the exact title, I'm sure some of you would know it. But it was this old book that was written by this guy, and he was talking about savages, and he was talking about European civilized men, and all this stuff. And I mean, that was in my first graduate seminar. And of course, I very hesitantly, as a young budding graduate student, raised my hand, and we were asked to write a book review. And when I wrote my review, it was extremely critical and angry. And the professor called me in. He gave me a C on the book review, and he said, "This is just polemical. You haven't criticized anything. You've just said you don't like any of it." And I said, "But I don't." It's horrible. And I talked to him about what I disliked. And it was really an interesting conversation, because it made me understand then it wasn't just the old books that were written by these old guys, it was the academy itself. And it was still being perpetuated. The same ideas of Indian people should sit down and shut up. And that, we didn't have a perspective that was valid because the Europeans were telling us what our perspective should be. So it was crazy stuff. Did I answer your question? I don't even remember what you asked.
That's why it was history, and that totally makes sense. Because you read those books, and like Grant Foreman and Angie DeBow, those are they're very good history books, but they're very also limited in kind of how they're written, which you kind of went over already. Was there anything maybe you wanted to add about the way that those two authors in particular are kind of held up as Oklahoma Indian histories, and they're kind of almost untouchable, it feels like?
Yes, absolutely. They're sort of icons in the field, and their works are very valuable. So let's make clear, at least my perspective on what they have written is extremely useful in terms of foundational information. DeBow is wonderful. Generally speaking, Foreman, he's written so many things and stuff that you don't find anywhere else. This is the old style history where Foreman and DeBow, schlepped around the archives and really got into the government records and stuff in a way that most students don't want to do these days. It's terribly difficult work. And so they were the first ones that began this idea that colonization was not a positive thing. And so for that, we have to be thankful. But now our path is different, and the work that we have to do is of a different nature. So I don't think that we can keep away from them so much, but we do need to understand that this is not something that can stand. It is white history about Indian people, and it's just got to be over. So my phone is making strange noises, so put it down. Hope it goes away.
And then you obviously have this very important kind of intervention by using Choctaw language sources. So what was your kind of experience in that? What was it like to kind of come across them in the archives, and what was your maybe method of using them?
Well, that was kind of a shock. When I went to the, I guess it was the Western History library there at OU, at University of Oklahoma, and started delving in the archives, I kept coming across all of these archives that were written in Choctaw, and I was just amazed. So I had to brush up on what little I knew of the Choctaw language, and I spent months, hours and hours and hours studying Choctaw to be able to. The problem was that if you speak Choctaw today, it's a different language from what it was in 1850. So these archives, if they were written in 1828 or 1850 or even 1870 or 80, the dialect is different, the colloquialisms are different. So it's quite a big chore to try to translate those archives so that you can understand what the people are saying. So it's very exciting, and it's something that that graduate students coming up now should be doing. There's more and more university level language courses in Indigenous languages. So any young scholar that's not writing using the Indigenous language about of the people that they're studying needs to re-examine that and think again about what are you missing? What is it that you're not seeing that's right there in the archives? The other thing is, some of the elders that I interviewed, their English wasn't very good. And so, I would have a couple of friends of mine that were more fluent in Choctaw that would come along and help interview some of these elders and ask them questions in Choctaw, which these older people spoke. And so, it helped clarify things in many ways. So it was very useful. So I would recommend strongly that anybody that wants to write about the Choctaw people, if you don't know the language, if you didn't grow up in the culture, then what are you missing? And you need to interrogate your methods and ideas about how to write authoritatively about those people if they're not yours.
Yeah. Do you have an example of maybe like what were some of the questions that you asked elders that you kind of incorporated into the book, or were some things that you read in Choctaw language that changed how you understood the history and gave you that kind of Choctaw perspective?
Yeah. Especially in the back to the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, some of the Choctaw records talked about what happened on the treaty ground. Mm-hmm. And they're in Choctaw language. And if you just throw those aside, then you get what some of the authors that are non-native, that's how they came up with their erroneous stories about what happened. They just used the government records and said, oh, well, this is, so you get the Secretary of State, who was the perpetrator of the frauds, and they would take his account and say, okay, this is what happened. And then they just reiterate that instead of looking at Choctaw sources that were buried in the archives or that Choctaw language. And so that's the problem.
Yeah.
Many other examples of that, but that's one that comes to mind.
Yeah. And then I was also kind of wondering about how you learned, maybe, I guess it seems like it was from your grandmother, but what are some other kind of experiences that you had with the culture growing up or in the language? Because everyone just loves to hear about that.
Well, I think all of us, to a certain extent, depending on our age, somewhat, have experienced different eras of Choctaw history. So, my grandmother was born in, I think it was 1902, and my mother was born in 1928. And so those two women had different experiences, as have I, of what it's like to be a child. And the traditional stories have been passed down through our storytellers and our elders, but they do evolve somewhat because sometimes they become difficult to understand by younger generations. And so they're just very slightly changed. They're extremely valuable source material. And so that's been, one of the things growing up. I heard lots of the oral traditions, but when I started researching, I went to many of the elders and I asked what their stories were. And sometimes I got brand new stuff that I'd never heard of, and I'm going, really? I didn't know that. But then over and over, I also got reinforcement of the stories as told to me by my family. And so those kinds of experiences are really essential. And I think that, as an anthropologist doing field work, that, you don't just go write a book without without talking to people, without doing your field work, without having informants, without, in the historical methods, without looking at all the archives you can find and doing oral history. So if you're doing Indigenous history and you're not doing oral history, then you're missing one of the main sources, the most important sources there are. And you absolutely have to use those methods to get to a completer picture of the people that you're studying, the people that you're writing about.
Yeah, super important. And I guess that leads us to the next question. So much of the book is about the integral role of Choctaw women and how we're kind of the backbones of our societies. And so, the changes that come with colonization are really have such reverberating kind of impacts.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering if you could share with everyone some of these really kind of big moments and their kinds of effects. And
yeah, it's extremely important to understand that the Choctaws were matrilineal, and our kinship organization was around clans. In the Western European and American societies, it's patriarchal and patrilineal society. And especially if we go back to the 19th century or late 18th century, we see that the invaders that were coming into the Choctaw Nation were beginning to disrupt some of the kinship practices and beliefs that the Choctaws had practiced for millennia. So one of those things is that the center of society. They are the foundation. They are the most powerful people because they were born with the ability to give life. That is not something that's acquired. It's something that is innate. And so that's why women were so special and why they were the center of everything, because they could make new life in the form of human beings, but also as agricultural people, they could raise the plants. They planted the plants, they raised the crops, they harvested the crops, and they were essential to giving life. So all of that fits under the category of giving life. So now we look at the male gender. What do the male gender do in traditional societies like the Choctaws? Well, they defend the people, they make war, they uphold traditions, they teach the young, and they do all sorts of things like, they're the, I guess we could call, loosely speaking, they provide police functions, like making sure that everybody behaves themselves at the stomp dances or whatever it is we're talking about patrol wise. But aside from that, they're just our partners. So the women, we would call on men to come and clear the fields. If we were starting a new field and we needed to put some crops in, the men would come and help with the heavy work. They would also help with the heavy work if there were buildings or anything like that that were going up. But besides that, women were the center. If you take away women from a traditional indigenous people, you have nothing. The nation dies. So women perform this essential central function. It was also very much wrapped up with spiritual beliefs. The Choctaw people believed that a woman brought corn to the people. So our spiritual beings, many of them are females. If you look at the patriarchal religion of Christianity, that's not true. In some Christian sects, like the Catholics, revere Mary the Mother. But in evangelical or non-Catholic denominations, Mary's just, a vehicle for God to, deliver Jesus. So it's not the same thing. And among indigenous people, matrilineal tribes are very common. In fact, I think the majority of, from what I've read anyway, the majority of indigenous people in the United States and the nation are matrilineal or were in the past. So the problem with the historical record of invasion and conquest by the Americans was the imposition of their gender norms, their beliefs in patriarchy, hierarchy, individualism, and the whole pantheon of capitalist, neoliberal kind of beliefs. And so the very first thing they did was with the missionaries coming in. The missionaries would teach Christian views. And all through the Bible and all through their teachings, they taught that women should be behind men, that men should be the head of the family, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a mess. But the big thing started with the Armstrong Roll in 1829, 30, actually 30, 31, excuse me. And the Armstrong Roll was the removal rules that the Choctaw Nation had to conform to. So the U.S. removal agents came in and they took this roll and they enrolled families by head of household male. Well, if you look at this, the women had always been in charge of the land, the houses, all the property, and the children. It was all controlled by women. And so when the U.S. came in and said, okay, men, all of a sudden you have all that power and we're going to take it away from the women because they're supposed to be subordinate to you. Don't you understand? Well, a lot of the men didn't understand and they conformed to it because they were required to. And the rations and the supplies that were given to various groups that were forced to remove were according to male head of household. So what happened to the women? All of a sudden, they are stripped of their ability to control the land that was given out in Oklahoma and every other thing that was done. So that was a real tremendous blow. And then the removal itself, the dispossession, worked travesty. It was just chaos on the people because the clans were spread out in a particular organization in Mississippi. And when we had to remove in this chaotic, disastrous, lethal trail of tears, or Choctaws call it trail where we cry, the new settlements in what was the new Western Choctaw Nation were totally different. The settlement patterns did not replicate what was in the East. And so the clans were diminished in terms of where they lived and how they worked in terms of controlling the towns, controlling the government, controlling the groups of elders. And then the second thing about the removal was that many of our elders didn't make it. They were either left behind or they didn't come, or they died en route. And so when our people arrived in Oklahoma, many people were just beside themselves with psychological damage and all kinds of anomia, and they just gave up. They just sat where they were delivered and they didn't move. So the patterns were not replicated. And I could go on and on about that, but that was one of the big problems because the destruction of the clans by the U.S. government was a key part of the Choctaw story. And if the clans, matrilineal clans, were diminished, then that means the role of women was also greatly impacted negatively. So I'll quickly jump to the late 19th century and the Dawes Act and all of that stuff. Here we go again. It was the same story. So what remained of women's power and what remained of traditional Choctaw beliefs in the centrality of women was again, that it was specifically attacked by Christian missionaries and the Society of Americans at large, but especially in terms of the legislation, because in the Dawes rolls, again, if you look at the Dawes list, you can see that, your dad or your great, 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 great grandfather who appears on the Dawes roll is the first of his family, and then all of the children and the wife come under him, which is completely contrary to the gender roles assigned to matrilineal uncles and their matrilineal nephews and nieces who they fathered, essentially, in the sense of, they fulfill the role of father to their matrilineal nieces and nephews. I'm sorry to throw that in. That's probably complicated for some people. Some of you understand what I'm talking about in terms of matrilineal gender and where, the father's role is resident in matrilineal uncles, not in your biological father.
Wow, it's just so much to kind of take in and
yeah, I know.
realize. Mm-hmm. It's such a long arc of history that you have to kind of keep track of, but yes. In some ways, a lot of it repeats, and like as you kind of say with the elimination of the Klan, with the Armstrong roll, and then we see it again in the Dawes rolls.
Yes, absolutely. And all kinds of other factors being thrown in, but we don't have time to get into all of that. So, yeah.
Again, you can always read the book, you guys. All right. So, your book is from like 1830 to 1860, and so you actually kind of also you talk about when Choctaws first arrived and how there were indigenous people already in the land and how they kind of interacted. And I think this is definitely something that's not talked about as much. Mm-hmm. And so could you share a little bit about that history with everyone?
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting, I think, because if you look at what happened in the 1820s, rather, the Cherokees, even back in the teens in 1812, after 1812, the Cherokees were being forced out of their ancestral homelands in the Carolinas and Tennessee and Georgia. And when they were forced, some groups went ahead and moved to the West, immigrated to the West early. And those guys are called the old settlers. But at any rate, for our story, what they were doing was that the Cherokees began to move into Western Arkansas and the eastern border of Oklahoma. And this was in the teens and 20s, but especially in the 20s, what you look at in terms of the indigenous peoples that were already there were the Osage. Those were their lands. And the U.S. government was really, really busy in the 18 teens and 20s trying to steal all of the Osage land that they could lay their hands on, because the Osage claimed this enormous body of land from the Mississippi River to the Rockies and from the Missouri River all the way down to the Canadian River. It was incredible. And so, in keeping with this design of the U.S. government to clear the eastern lands of indigenous peoples, they needed some place for them to go. So the Cherokees get out there, the Osage are already there. They have a tremendous war that goes on for years and years and years in the 1820s. And at the same time, the U.S. Army and the U.S. government is trying to steal all of their land through false treaties, through fake treaties and fraudulent treaties, and trying to decimate them militarily. But one of the things that happened then when the Choctaws and the Chickasaws and the others started moving west was they not only there were Osage problems in the northern parts of their territory, but there were also many other indigenous peoples. So we had the western portion of what was supposedly given to the Choctaw Nation was filled with Comanches, Apaches even, Kiowas, Arapaho, Cheyenne, And in the southern portion, that was occupied by the Wichitas and the Caddos and some of the tribal nations that are smaller and less well known, like the Quapaws and so forth. So all of these people were being invaded by Indians. How crazy is that? So we got, the white people coming into Arkansas, what now is Arkansas, and eastern Oklahoma, and illegally just squatting and throwing up farms and everything else they can do as fast as they can. And they're battling all the indigenous people, the immigrant Indians, and the indigenous peoples of those lands. So everybody's fighting everybody. It's insane. And, until the U.S. extinguished the title to most of the lands of the Osage, there were tremendous, terrible battles and warfare constantly going on between all of the immigrant Indians and those. But there's an interesting thing that I heard from one of the elders was telling me, and then I asked my grandmother about it. Yeah, she knew too. But they were talking about when the people in the Choctaw Nation used to talk about Comanche moons. And I said, oh, I think I heard that. What does that mean? And she said a Comanche moon is a full moon. And that was when the Choctaws, especially the ones that were Chickasaws or the Choctaws who were living out near where the Chickasaws are now, they were saying, they would be absolutely terrified because that's when the Comanches would do their raids because they had bright moon to go by. And so they used to call that a Comanche moon. And some places in Oklahoma, they still call it that, but people don't know why.
Well, now people know where that thing comes from.
Yeah.
Crazy. And then so that's kind of the beginning of when Choctaws are in Indian territory. And then you start to go, and towards the end, you talk about how the US government extends its jurisdiction into Choctaw Nation, which is just so relevant with recent Supreme Court ruling on McGirt.
Yes.
Do you have any comments on that based on your kind of background in this history?
Well, I was just shocked when I heard about that ruling and delighted, to say the least. The McGirt ruling is a tremendously important ruling. And I think we're going to see a lot of follow-on court cases, that not only will arise directly from McGirt, but also from the small glimmer of hope that the Gorsuch opinion has given indigenous nations and their lawyers. So, if anyone's that's in law or aspiring to be a lawyer, it's a great time to go into Indian law, and it's going to be a really big deal. So, in the Choctaw instance, and the parallels with what took place and with the McGirt ruling, which is really dealing only with the Creeks, we had the almost identical experience. So, and the lands that the majority opinion we're talking about include the Choctaw, old Choctaw counties. So, all of this is going to take place in the old Choctaw Nation. So the state jurisdiction is going to be withdrawn from everything but the Major Crimes Act cases. So kidnapping, murder, I think there's one other. But the state rulings that have already come down are going to be challenged by many people. And so it's going to be a huge change. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I but somebody that's an expert like Sarah Deer, one of our other Indigenous colleagues, could more adequately address it. But my non-legal take on it is that with the challenge and the challenge to what was done in 1906 by the U.S. government in abolishing tribal courts, and then the assumption illegally of state jurisdiction this is going to cause huge changes in Oklahoma and perhaps elsewhere. So it's exciting.
And so that's kind of the questions about the book. And so is there anything that you learned in the process of writing the book that you didn't expect to find, but then obviously did and had to talk about?
Yeah, there's a number of things. I was surprised by the amount of archives I found written in Indigenous languages. So that's first and foremost. So young scholars like you and many others need to be looking in those archives, and they need to be reading the Indigenous language archives for decolonizing purposes. And so I was also surprised by the loss of original documents, by archival material, by the very underfunded repositories in the state of Oklahoma. That to me was a shock. I went up to let's see, what is it called? The Five Civilized Tribes Museum. Had, at least the time in the 90s when I was doing my research, they had an annex where they were keeping original documents. And I went back there one day and I found 2 boxes full of handwritten letters, one of a kind. They were just stuffed into shoe boxes. They had never been accessed. Nobody had ever gone through them. I started looking through them, and they were mainly about the election of 1898, the chief election, the principal chief. And there was some priceless information in there that should have been, certainly preserved. And I later heard that some of that stuff was destroyed and some of it was sent over to to Tulsa University. But I don't know what happened to that. So it's things like that that I found really shocking. But the other thing, real quickly, would be that I found a lot of English language archives that were not accessed by scholars who had written books on the Choctaw people. So that was a big shock too. And some of these people were held up as very authoritative scholars. Mm-hmm. I would encourage historians or aspiring historians to really look into the written archives and actually do the grunt work, because I mean it's not easy and it's hard to do if the archives are not published online.
Yes, definitely. Too many things. It's like, I'm technically trained as an anthropologist, but like there's so much material and like no one has ever given this any attention.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. There's plenty of work to do if anyone wants to study this, is what I want everyone to know.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of all the questions that I have. So now we're going to kind of go to the question and answers that people have submitted online. So if you have a question, go ahead and put those into the Q&A kind of section. Okay, so our first question comes from Catherine Cleveland. She says, after the Eurocentric distortion of Indigenous history and culture, is it still ethical for non-natives to pursue academic careers in Native American studies?
Oh, I don't know. That's a real conundrum, and I think many people have wrestled with that. My personal view is that the problem that I encountered and people of my generation and the time frame when I entered the academy encountered was that there were too many seats at the table that were taken up by non-native people who wanted to do Indian history. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, if the table is full and there are no more seats, Indigenous people could not find a seat at the table. And that was very true with the academic process of tenure too. There were a number of my colleagues who were Indigenous scholars that were coming up at the same time as I did in the academy, and very, very few of them got tenure. And so they were lost to the academy, and they were very important voices. So it's a problem. I don't think that non-native people cannot do native history, but I think that it's the very first thing that non-native people especially, but also native scholars, need to do is read Decolonizing Methodologies. And if after reading that book and considering all of the issues, you can still say to yourself, well, I have a reason to be at the table, then, go ahead. But if you can't honestly say that to yourself, it's just that you want to be there and you don't care if Native people are excluded, then I guess that's your prerogative. But I think it's extremely important for Native people to be included and Native voices. And really, this has nothing to do with race so much as it does with culture. And I think that's important. There are a lot of Native people that are coming up that know absolutely nothing about their Native heritage. They don't know the language. They don't know the culture because they weren't raised in it. And so, are those people to be more privileged because they have more Indigenous heritage than somebody that is not Native? I'm not so sure about that. To me, if you haven't grown up in the culture, you don't know the language, and you identify with different cultural tradition, then it's a little bit more difficult to say you should take up more places at the table than Indigenous people. But there again, Indigenous meaning what? So that comes back to the real problem that is often brought up of, who's an Indian?
Yeah, it's really about a commitment to Native people and holding them up in our traditions and our culture. And so that's always at the foremost.
Well, that's what Smith talks about, is giving back to Native communities. If you're in it to advance your own career, then, that's problematic. If you're in it to provide source material, to provide education, to provide books, to provide projects that Indigenous nations identify they want done, that's completely different, I think. That begins to validate your work.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Tully says, "Yeah, Cookie, thank you for your book. I bought it for my daughter and I've used it as a reference for me. Besides your book, what is other required reading for Choctaws?"
That's problematic. There's a number of books that have been written in the last few years that I'm not particularly fond of. But I think everyone's entitled to their opinion. I would stay away from books that are not written by people who are culturally Choctaw. So, that's a matter of interpretation. But in terms of removal, which is, I think, a terribly important area, Grant Foreman and DeVoe still provide some really good basic knowledge. And there's this old book called The Removal of the Choctaw Indians. It's written by Arthur DeRosier. Got it? Oh, they're reprinting. Excellent.
I have stack because I have a different project that I'm working on, so it's just like right next to my computer.
Yeah, I like that book. It's got a lot of very specific information, and DeRosier did a good job. And he wrote in like 1970, I think, is the original copyright for that book. So, and he's non-native, so it's interesting to see his work. It was very valuable in terms of some of the details about removal.
Yes. And then another question that he had that I'll read is like, where to collect stories and histories of our people, where do you recommend that we start?
I'm sorry, what was your question?
If we are to collect the stories and histories of our people, where do you recommend that we start?
Oh, that's good. That's a good question. I think, first we have to start with the oral traditions. So talk to everyone that's over 70 that you can, that identifies themselves as Choctaw. Then seek out others. Go down to southeastern Oklahoma and wander around in the little towns and rural areas and ask who the storytellers are, who knows our history. And you'll find a number of resources and people that are referred by others. And it's extremely important to go and collect those stories. But you always have to be skeptical, just like any good scholar always is, and gather the stories, but but you do have to think critically about the source and, the narrative that they have access to. Are they regurgitating something they read, that was written by a non-Choctaw scholar? Or are they telling you oral traditions that they heard when they were a child? Big difference. So I think you start with the oral traditions and you read everything that you can on the Choctaw people and on people of the Southeast. I'm sure you know Charles Hudson's work, right? He's an anthropologist, and he's got a really good book. I can't think of the name of it. But it's got a lot of interesting material about spiritual beliefs and traditions and cultural practices that I haven't seen anywhere else about the Choctaw specifically. And then the third thing that I would do is go back to the really old stuff, the ethnology that was written in the late 19th century, at the beginning, the forerunners really of anthropology, and read some of their stuff like Cushman, Swanton, some of those guys, because some of their firsthand observations, even though they're colored through a Eurocentric perspective, it's still interesting stuff and it's valuable stuff.
Yes. And then Brian has a question. So I guess in reference to the way you were talking about how it was just one group at Dancing Rabbit Creek who signed the kind of removal treaty, and I think this is kind of about when Brian sent the question, but he asked, so were the signatures by other chiefs on the Treaty of Doak Stand forged?
No, Treaty of Doak Stand is different. I was talking about Dancing Rabbit Creek. So Doak Stand was signed by at least 3 principal chiefs, maybe more minor chiefs. But the U.S. government was never very careful in terms of who they identified signed. So, for example, a lot of people at Doak Stand and other earlier treaties just made an X. They were illiterate. And if the U.S. negotiators wanted to say this was Chief so-and-so, instead of some suborned, guy they picked up off the road drunk, and they did that because the chief themselves could not write their own name in many cases. And so you have to be fairly skeptical of what you see in these government records, even treaties.
Oh, Ryan actually just texted and he said he actually meant the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, all the other kinds of signatures on there.
Okay. Greenwood LaFleur had a bunch of folks that were signing names other than the ones that were present. And I don't know what the full story on that is. I haven't found any sources, archival or oral, on how that took place. But I know what you're talking about, Ryan, and that's a good catch. It is an interesting question. Maybe that's something that you can investigate and find some information on.
Yes, Ryan actually works for our historic preservation department. And so yes, we will always be on the lookout for it. And then I have a question from a Dr. Sherman, one of your former graduate assistants. She says, thank you for this. How do we force the decolonization of history and the academy if things like language and oral traditions are not recognized as valuable historiography?
That's a great question. And hello, Dr. Sherman. It's pushing back. It's standing our ground. I'll never forget a very prominent Indian history scholar non-native guy in 1990 telling me, or 89 or 90 anyway, telling me that oral history was not a source material that was valid. And so therefore I should leave oral history or oral traditions entirely out of my work. That was very common in that time frame. I've been led to believe that in more recent times that mainstream historians are more accepting of that. But I say the problem is with the methodology and the orthodoxy of the scholars of history, not in the source usage of indigenous scholars who do privilege and make central these other sources. They're just as valid as somebody that's prejudiced writing down their point of view. So to me, it always was a silly question. So if I look at what a missionary or a government official wrote in 1870, how is that more valuable or more valid than what somebody like my grandmother or some other storytellers have passed down through the oral traditions? I don't see that that's so. They just wrote it down at a specific point in time. And so I reject that. And I think that's the only thing that we can do as Native people is to say, no, I'm not conforming to that. And if therefore you don't want to think that any of my scholarship is important, then you go ahead and think that. But there are lots of people who do value it and who do think it's important. So there again, I would refer you back to decolonizing methodologies, because Linda talks about that extensively in her book, and it's very important discussion. So it's a great question. Thanks for asking that.
And maybe just like 2 years ago, I had a very prominent non-native historian tell me that he didn't use oral histories because they weren't peer reviewed.
Well, there again, people privilege what they think is important, and they also create boundaries that they then impose on us as Indigenous people. And if you just cower in the corner and say, yes, of course, I'm a lowly graduate student and you're a big, bad, important scholar, and therefore I'm going to say you're right and I'm wrong. Don't do that. That's not what we need to do. And it's so important to demand that white scholars and non-native scholars recognize our method and authenticate them at some point. And many of them have in the last few years. So hopefully those dinosaurs are on their way out. Oh, that's not respectful. Okay, I take that back. But I think, how do I phrase that? So maybe those people are receding in importance in terms of the newer scholarship.
Yes, he's definitely been extensively critiqued. So it's totally fine. And I guess one last question is maybe this perfect way, but someone asked, who is your grandmother?
My mother was Ruth Dodd. Her family name is Fowler, and her father was a LaFleur. So it's our Choctaw people are mainly the LaFleurs, the Gardners. We trace our heritage back to Thomas LaFleur, and he married a niece of Pushmataha. So it's a long heritage, but yeah.
Excellent. So that's kind of all that we have time for today. So I just wanted to thank Dr. Akers so much for sharing her time, her work, and her knowledge. So much of her work has shaped so much of my own scholarship, and I'm really thankful personally. And I'm so glad that she was able to join us today. And so our next Choctaw will be the Choctaw filmmaker, Mark D. Williams, and he will be in conversation with us on Friday, August 21st at 11 a.m. So join us again at that time. He'll be talking with Historic Preservation's Deanna Bird and Misty Madbull, and they'll be talking about his journey in filmmaking, including a film that he's currently working on with Choctaw Nation. So thank you again for joining us. Chipisala everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.